I hope you had a great break and welcome back. Now let's get started with Module 2, where we're going to start talking about how to move Azure virtual machines and the compute side of migrations into Azure and talk about the importance of the landing zones. Welcome to Module 2, where we're going to talk about Windows Server compute migration. In other words, how do we move virtual machines? So let's go ahead and get started. Smart Hotel, our example company here that you'll see throughout the demos, is we have some VMware machines, physical machines, but we're going to focus on the Hyper-V virtual machines and move them over with our Azure Migrate tools. And really, when we start thinking about this, when you ask questions, we use Smart Hotel as my example, as kind of my demo company for this, but ask your question, what kind of application dependencies do the VMs? How do they relate to each other? Are they three-tiered application inside of Azure? How do we migrate VMware VMs? How do we migrate Hyper-V? The processes are different. We're going to focus just on Hyper-V for this particular demonstration. How can we handle those actual on-prem migrations as well to virtual machines? And how do we migrate file servers? Lots of choices, and we'll talk about all of these throughout the module. We'll focus on a Hyper-V assessment that's already been completed, as well as a migration. I'll show you where that is as we move through this section. So whenever we look at migration, what are some triggers? Why do we think about migrating to the environment? Our data centers might be expiring. We have a lot of customers that are in that hardware refresh policy. Hey, you know what? Instead of rebuying the hardware, refreshing that data center, let's move some of those workloads to Azure. Maybe we have acquisitions for our companies and we need to bring them in. They might already have a footprint for Azure, or it makes sense to move those into Azure as well. We might have urgent needs. I always like to call this the viral event that all of our companies are seeking, where all of a sudden we need more storage that we didn't have. Well, where are we going to go? We can't get the SAN quick enough. Azure has plenty. Cloud services have plenty. We talked about hardware and software refresh. Security threats. What are some things that might have occurred on-prem that we might be able to help mitigate when we move to cloud? I think one of my favorites, and we'll talk about this in Module 5, is we actually have a thing when we're syncing identity called password hash synchronization. And a lot of people are like, what? You're sending my password to the cloud? That's not secure. In reality, the way we hash that password, it's actually more secure in transit than it is while it's at rest on your domain controllers. And we'll talk a bit about that as we move through. The security is something you want to look at. And as we know, security threats, there's no magic bullet to solve all of those security threats. You want to think about it in layers. The cool thing about when you go to a cloud model and when you use Azure, you have a friend. You have Microsoft to help you that. We have a shared responsibility model for all of these things. And when you look at Microsoft, fundamentally, I know a lot of folks have some history with Microsoft and the things that we've done in the past. I will tell you, our company has really changed on how we look at security. Matter of fact, I'll tell you right now, we're the largest security company you've probably never heard of. Compliancy, this is always an important thing. We maybe not be compliant on-prem. How do we move it? What kind of governance? Do we want new things? I've talked about rhinoceroses before. I'll talk about it again. Hey, application innovation. We can't do this on-prem. We have a business need, a business solution. Can't make it. Well, let's look at the cloud. How do we deploy that? And software, end of support. EOS, or end of support events, are a very common trigger. When your operating systems start going out of support, you got to be very conscious about, hey, if I'm running unsupported services knowingly, you could very well be violating some compliances that you currently have in place. Windows Server is 2012 Server R2 is that set to expire at the end of October. I'm kind of sad. I wrote a book on Windows Server 2012, so I guess my book expires on 2023 as well. And SQL Server, the latest version, expires on 2022. So understand, part of those things when you move to cloud can help migrate that and move those faster for you. Whenever you're going to migrate across this, you want a unified experience. Whenever we're looking at migration, and again, we're talking about the tools. What happened before the tools? Planning. We thought about our environment. We looked at, hey, we're going to move these. We're going to move in these thoughtful manner. Now we engage our tool sets. And our tool sets are really nice. And the first one we're going to do is assessing our environment. What does it look like? How are we going to move that information? What kind of servers are there? What are they going to look like? How do we get them set up? How do we get them replicating to Azure? And then how do we migrate them to Azure? Now, something we don't talk about in this course is after migration. What do you do after you migrate these servers? You want to optimize. We'll talk a bit about that from a standpoint at a high level, but understand just because you got them from point A to point B doesn't mean your work is done yet. We still have things that we have to do to optimize those servers. We still have things from a security and management. So when we look at this, we have tools that are going to really help you be successful throughout this process. And again, below these tenets, know your target architecture, have that landing zone ready, have your governance in place, have your network connectivity in place, have your security, your authorization in place, and have your folks trained. Throughout this entire migration process, this can be looked at as something you have to do. It's fundamental to having a successful migration experience when you move to Azure. The tool we have is Azure Migrate, and we actually do several things in Azure Migrate that works with it. We are agentless migrations, so we don't have to install an agents on local systems. We also have an agent-based migration. If we want to migrate, especially with VMware, that's one way to move those servers. We can migrate VMware, Hyper-V, physical servers, Windows servers, Linux servers, even servers in other clouds. We can migrate SQL or non-SQL servers in part of our data migration sets. We can bring in our web apps. I'm going to show you the tool here in just a moment, and it's a rather robust tool. So we're going to take a tour, we're going to move around it, and we have a lot of third-party solutions that can integrate it with it. So we can integrate those servers and feed them directly into Azure. Now, the tools that we have different tools at different stages of the migration. Now, some of the tools are very much related together. So we have different sets of tools for Azure Migrate. We have our own discovery and assessment tools. I'll show you where those are at in just a moment. We have our data migration assistant that's actually going to help evaluate our data tools. We have our SQL Server data migration assistant as well. For our migration tools, we have an Azure Server Migrate tool. We have our Azure Database Migration tool, and we have DataBox to move lots of data. We have Azure Cost Management as a part of this. We have Azure Advisor, which is another monitoring tool that'll help establish some of those baselines. And of course, inside of Azure, we have a whole plethora of security and management tool sets. So we have tools to help you on every stage, especially through that migration. But as I mentioned before, we also love our partners. We love our ISVs. There are a lot of partners that have different services to help you move and keep your data in governance, like Chef and Puppet. If you're trying to look at governance technologies, Cloudomize for moving that information into Zerto for migrating that information and replicating it. We love our partners here. So folks, we have some tool sets that we really believe in. That's what we're going to see in these modules. But don't discount if you're using some of these partners today for services, they may be able to offer you some additional tooling that's there. And I know some of these ISV and some of these partners not only offer the tools, and they may well use Azure Migrate as well as part of their foundation, or they might have other tools that plug into it, but you're also getting a consultant. You're getting somebody who can actually do that work for you or with you to be a part of that process. Having that kind of, as I mentioned before, having that unbiased paid for opinion can be invaluable to you as your organization as you move those servers for a successful migration. So we love our partners through this. Whenever we want to migrate on-prem to Azure, we talk about this. Discover and assess and migrate your servers. Know what we're going to do. And so when we start working with this environment, we're going to have to install some agents on servers. Which servers do we install them on? How do we get those servers talking to our Azure subscription? And then when we start talking about it, what do we want to migrate? In what order? How do we want to migrate some of these servers? How do we want to move these servers across into Azure? And how do we migrate that data to support those environments? And so whenever we're discovering those servers, this is just a quick discovery. Hey, what's there? And as I've mentioned before, we can look at VMs in VMware, VMs in Hyper-V, physical servers, AWS, Google Cloud. We have all those services that we can look at where we can find out what's going on. And then we have a choice once we've assessed all this and said, hey, these are all these servers. Which ones do we want to replicate and migrate into Azure? So the great thing about the assessment, it's at a bare minimum, it's a discovery tool. And even if you don't migrate, you're going to get just a truckload of information about what's happening inside your environments. There's a lot of third-party tools to assess these, Cloudimize, Device42. There are some free tools, there's paid tools, there's a variety of this. Once again, we work a lot with our partners. We have our own set of tools. It all depends on which tool you choose. Sometimes the tools are free, but they come with a paid consultant. So make sure you look at some of the details of our partners. Our tools are free. They're built into Azure for us to use and leverage inside of it. And that's what we're going to see here in just a minute. The cool thing about the assessment tool that you're going to see today is it does a readiness assessment. It says, hey, are these servers ready? What are they going to look like? Do we have any concerns or any servers unhealthy? And we're going to evaluate those. What size of VMs? Now, this one, when you migrate, you're going to want to control, because when you start assessing those servers, you have the ability to say, you know what? The Azure sizing that we have here doesn't fit what we're trying to move. You can change this. You have a manual choice. Azure's going to guess, saying, hey, based on what I see here, I think these are the VMs they should move into when we replicate them. You're going to get a cost estimation through this process of what it's going to be. And then you're going to be able to have a dependency analysis. I'll tell you what, of all the tools that I really, really dig with Azure Migrate, it's that dependency analysis. It actually shows you how the servers relate together, and we're going to see that as part of the demonstration here in a moment. And this is a screenshot of what you're going to see in a moment. But the nice thing about it, it tells you how everybody's related, what ports are available to us or what are open on those servers. It's going to give you an example of what it looks like. And some of you might use a tool, especially my app devs out there, Application Insight, that does it from an application level. This is from a server level. So it's very similar, but it's how do our servers relate to each other, and we're going to see that in a moment. And whenever we're going to assess, we support, as we've mentioned, several scenarios. VM migration to the VMware service, VMs to Azure IaaS, Hyper-V VMs to Azure IaaS, physical servers to migration to Azure, Azure AWS, GCP. All these servers get moved into Azure for us to use and work. So let's actually take a look. Enough talk about these tools, and let's take a quick tour into our Azure migration tools. So let me flip over to my Azure portal here. And so in my Azure portal, how I start this conversation, you can either, if you have used it frequently, you'll be here. But you can always get into Migrate by simply going to the search bar and typing in Azure Migrate, and it should be one of the top options. Just kind of a server admin 101 here, what's really cool. If you've never seen it, whenever you run the search in Azure, it also does a search for other articles that are related to what we have. And so I say, hey, I want to look at Azure Migrate documentation. I can click on that, and it takes me right to the full migration document website. So we talk about all the different tools that we support for VMs, Hyper-V, physical servers, VMs, and other clouds. There's how-to guides in all of this on our documentation site. And all we had to do was a quick search from inside the portal to make that happen. So I have Azure Migrate. I'm just going to go ahead and select it right here. And this is our main tool. Now, I've done a lot of little legwork just from a time perspective. A lot of these tools just take time to run. I think my assessment took close to 30 minutes to 45 minutes to run. So as you hopefully can gather, I've already done that assessment. So we'll have some discovery information. I'll even show you a little bit about what we are discovering and what we're actually using to leverage inside of Azure. But this tool, as we get started into our environment, says, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to do server databases and web apps? Do you want to do databases only? Are there other scenarios like VDI that you need to look at? We have tools designed to help you with that. And I say, you know what? Let's just start with Discovery, Assess, and Migrate. It's going to drop me, first off, notice where it dropped me in the portal into the server database migration. And I actually have, and I'm going to move this to the left so we can kind of see a full view of it. We actually have a project here, Smart Hotel. When you first make a project, you get to pick your tools inside the environment. And if I say I want to change this project, it's going to ask me, hey, which projects do I have? I don't have any currently available to change to. This is the only one I have. But the nice thing about this, I can make my own project and bring in my own tools into Azure Migrate. And notice here, I have the Azure Discovery tool, and then right below it, I have the Azure Migrate tool. So I have the ability, and this is what I've already set up and loaded, and you see that I have some data here discovered, and we'll take a quick tour in a moment. But if there's other tools you want to add to this project, this is where you can get to those partner tools that have been vetted and registered with us. So if you want to use one of those other tools, we can look at them, we can learn more. They all do the same thing. They're just different vendors with different solutions that they might have. And the cool thing about that, you have to learn more here. And I just happen to click on the very top one. And it'll take you to an article on that particular vendor's website about what that migration tool set looks like, what they're selling, and how they work. So one of the nice things about these tools, we can always come in and add other tools if you don't want to use Azure Migrate. All right, so my tool is already there inside of my environment. Now, I've already run a discovery, but what I want to show you is how we would set this discovery up. Even though it takes a little bit of time to actually run the discovery, there is some legwork that I've already done for us, and I'll explain what I did right now. So the first thing is I'm going to say discover. And it's going to ask you a question here of what are we discovering? Do we have a CSV file? So if you don't want to run the agents on the systems or run an appliance there, we actually give you a CSV file where you can actually format and create. I will say from a small and mid-sized organization, CSV file is not a bad way to go. Although if you can do it, get the appliance. It makes your life way easier as you work with this environment and finding those servers that you want to migrate. And then it asks us, hey, what are we trying to migrate? Are these VMware servers? Are they Hyper-V servers? Are they physical or others? And this one interests me. And so when you think about migrating a server from another cloud provider, from an Azure perspective, it thinks it's another physical server running on another cloud. Well, you might think that's odd. Well, does anybody know what we call our on-prem environments? Private cloud. So it makes sense that we put it in that same ability for us to use. So I'm going to choose Hyper-V because that's what I did, I set up earlier. So I'm going to say yes with Hyper-V. Now, a couple things about this. You have to give this a name for your appliance that you're going to migrate, and it's going to generate a key. This is a registration key, and I'll show you what one looks like. That when I turn on the appliance on-prem, I'm going to have to say, hey, I need to register this appliance with Azure Migrate, so it ties to my subscription, because fundamentally, you all get the same appliance. So how does your appliance know to talk to your subscription and not somebody else? It's this registration key that we can use to help discover and find all of that. We have a choice. We can download a VHD file, which is what I did here, and I'll show you what that looks like on the back end inside the systems, or we can download a zip file. I normally just, if you're doing a Hyper-V migration, download the appliance in a VHD file. You can spin it up inside of Hyper-V and have it do the same work. There's some prereqs. When you set up the appliance, if I just do a quick look to the documentation here, it tells you what are some of the limits. We can assess only, I look at this now, I know some of you are going, wait, we have way more than this, but to me, hey, it can go up to 35,000 servers. Now, if you're like me, hey, I have less than 35,000, you just raise your hand and be happy with the tool that's there. You can add in more servers. You just have to add in more groups of computers to migrate, but we do have some limitations. You have to have a Hyper-V host. You have to have a certain operating system for that, what server requirements, and then you just have to have certain port access for this. The cool thing about this, it allows 3389, which is our common RDP port. There's a common appliance port that's set up when you configure that, and then 443, the HTTPS port. And for Hyper-V, it needs the 5985, 5986 port. And if you don't know what those are, it's for Windows Remote Management, mainly for PowerShell. So you're probably thinking, wait, that's how Migrate works? It has PowerShell commands? Absolutely. Under the covers, it's running a whole bunch of PowerShell stuff to make that happen. And then notice, I love this. You'll see this a lot in migration. Notice the very first word after you've configured the appliance, wait. It's going to tell us to wait for a little bit. Why? Because it's got to register the appliance, and then it's going to start its discovery process of when you point it to the resources. So let me show you kind of what we've discovered. So I'm going to flip over into one of my VMs here, which is a Hyper-V host, and this is where I installed this particular VM. And so if I go into my Hyper-V manager here, one of the servers I have currently running is the Azure Migration Appliance. This is the VHD file. The great thing about this, all I had to do from an Azure perspective is come in and import that particular virtual machine. And if I connect to this one real quick, we can see that I've registered the virtual appliance. So the actual appliance has a web interface for you to use and manage it. I've already checked connectivity. It'll do automatic updates for us as we're talking to Azure. This is where we register with this appliance. So we actually get the server management key. I do have to have valid credentials to log into the environment. And then I have to add in host credentials to talk to my Hyper-V system, whoever that environment is and whoever my discovery environment is. So I've already discovered it. I already have that initiated discovery, so I've already fed into my assessment. But I will tell you, all in told, this process takes about 35 to 40 minutes to get this all populating data when we can use Azure. And all this tool did is I pointed it to my Hyper-V host. I pointed it to the smart hotel host, which is kind of fun if you think about it. This is a VM running on a host that I'm discovering. So by installing this appliance and simply registering and saying I'm going to do this, I told it to discover the host. I gave it some login credentials so it could log in with an administrative context of the host. And it started doing that discovery process for me. So a little bit of what I've already set up. And the only reason I don't do the whole process, it does take about 30 to 45 minutes just for this part of migrations. We talk about one of the myths is migrations is as simple as flipping a switch. Oh boy, I wish that was true, because it would go fast. Migrations are slow and thoughtful, and they should be, because it's got a lot of stuff to find. So let me minimize this and go back into my Migrate tool. So that's how I've set it up. That's how I did my discovery process. You'll see that it already discovered some VMs. I've done a couple of assessments on those VMs. And when I discover them, I can even create groups. And so when I go into the discovered servers here, it's going to say some unsupported, but that's okay because I've already started migrating some of these systems that are here. They've already been found because I've created a group and done a full assessment on that. And they'll show not supported as they discovered it because I haven't assessed them yet. But if I go into my groups, this is where this gets exciting. So I actually have a smart hotel assessment. I've assessed 3 VMs. And it actually says it installed the agents on those inside the environment. So what happens as a part of my process, when I did the assessment, I loaded agents on these 3 VMs specifically to feed back into the assessment to let me know what's going on with those particular systems, how much storage they're going to have, what operating system. And you notice that my Linux friend here, my Ubuntu Web Application Firewall, it doesn't have an OS. Sometimes it doesn't, but when you do your replication process, your migration process, you can tell it what OS, what's going on in that particular VM. And it's from this assessment that it'll base on, hey, what instances do I need to put these particular systems in when I replicate them? And I'll show that to you in another demo. The replication process is already occurring under the environment for us. And I can always, if I want to, I can always come in and reassess this environment. If I want to, I can reassess what these VMs look like, how do I want to set it up at any time, and just say, hey, I need to look at them again. I can always view what existing assessments I have, but I also have the ability here to look at dependencies. Now, this is where this gets a little cool of what happens. So when I discovered these 3 VMs, inside of Azure, it's going to give me an idea of what those VMs look like. And you can see what client I have here. So I have the discovery process of my client, and it tells me where that client is, the private IP address, that's the host that I have. It has an Ubuntu server with 14 processes running onto it. And if I expand those, I can start to see those different processes come through to my environment. But I have the ability to really work with, and I'm only seeing the first couple of those, but I can see more inside of here. And what ports am I running over? What are those servers running? How are they connecting to the different environments? So I can always expand these nodes and get even more data if I need to, and say, hey, I look at maybe the Windows monitoring information, but it's pulling all that data for me. And this assessment's showing me how every one of those servers are related to each other. So when I do the migration, so I have the web front end, and then I most likely have a back end server that's using a different port, but I can see all of that process. So I get kind of an application map from a server's perspective of what's happening inside the environment. It automatically set all this up and fed it into Azure. This is just the Azure Migrate tool. A lot of our partners do something very similar as well when we're doing that migration into Azure. So those dependencies in that assessment are key to understand, hey, this is what we're working through as we leverage our environment. So we have the ability to always come in and create those assessments at any time we want. And to create an assessment, we can simply say this is an Azure VM. It's going to ask us what type of assessment, servers discovered by my appliance. And then I can say which servers do I want to select, and so I can use an existing group if I want. But notice it sees all those servers already. So those agents have already fed up saying, hey, these are the servers that you want to assess and look at. And all I have to simply do is just select the ones I want to look at to create my assessment and leverage it. And so you might be wondering, Why did I only choose 3 of the 5 VMs that were there? Well, I'm only talking about VM migration right now, so I'm only worried about this. So part of your planning process is, hey, which servers do I need to migrate in what order? Notice I didn't choose the SQL box yet. Why? I have another tool set that I'm going to use for SQL to migrate that particular environment. And you know what? I'm not going to migrate the server. I'm just going to migrate the database. Remember one of the first questions we have to ask ourselves, where are we going to migrate our data to? So these 3 VMs that I've talked, this is a lift and shift migration. I'm simply moving these VMs into Azure for me to use and leverage however I want. But that SQL database, I went, you know what? I'm not going to move the VM. I'm going to move this into cloud only. I'm going to move the data off that VM. Now, the rest of the applications might still be running on-prem or elsewhere. But the cool thing about this, I have a tool that does that for me, all built into Azure. And creating those assessments is really that easy to do. Once those agents have fed in, that appliance has fed information in to Azure, now all I have to do is simply say go. And it's going to find those servers, it's going to discovery, and that's when you get that rich assessment right away. And I've run a couple different locations, and notice, I should have pointed this out. This is really cool. Notice you can say, hey, I'm thinking about migrating this to North Europe or West US 2. Which one do I want to migrate? So you can create assessments based on which regions you could potentially migrate them to into Azure. And if I choose the one to North Europe, the great thing about this, it's going to give me, hey, what servers are ready, which ones are ready with conditions, I'll show you that in a moment, what my monthly cost is. So going to Europe, it's going to be about $108. What's the storage estimate for that? It's going to be about $11 a month. I have that information for me to look at that, and I can always recalculate it if I need to. If I go into the other assessments, let me go back one level here, and I go into Smart Hotel for West US 2, I can get those same servers, but notice West US 2 is a little bit less expensive. Hey, this is going to be about $50 a month for that server, about the same for storage. So what does that tell you about our regions? Not all regions cost the same. It's all dependent on which region you're in, where that region is, the monetary value of that region. So we have that ability to understand when we get those cost estimates. And the key word here is estimate, right? We're getting an estimate of what we're going to migrate and what we think they're going to look at. I can even look at Azure readiness here and say, hey, which ones are ready? Which ones are not ready? It says, hey, my 2 smart hosts are running Windows, they're ready. This one's an unknown OS. And what I can do is when I migrate it, tell it it's Linux. So I have the ability to fix that, but it said, you know what, I don't know what it is. And when you click on that, it actually takes you to a troubleshooting article. Hey, if you have assessment issues, this is where you can come in and take a look at it. And where does it say? Unknown operating system. Maybe something just didn't come across for whatever reason, but you'll want to make sure if you know what the OS is, that it's a supported operating system for the migration. I do know that a parent version of that server is, but I get that ability to look at that right here and understand, hey, what tool am I going to migrate this to? And it says, hey, what tool do you want to use to migrate? We recommend use the server migration tool, which I'll show you in just a little bit. We also have cost details here where I can really dig into when I migrated this, what did it think Smart Hotel 1 and 2 were supposed to be? What servers were they supposed to be? And it made a guess based on what it discovered from a memory perspective, from a storage perspective, and it breaks down those costs a little bit more. And if I just kind of move that over here, we can see a little bit more of what that monthly cost is for each VM. So we get an idea before we even migrate what it's going to look like to help us fulfill our plan. Because chances are, if somebody's asked you to migrate these VMs, they're going to say, that's great and fine and dandy. How long is it going to take? And then, oh, by the way, how much is it going to cost? Our readiness assessment is going to give you those ideas of what this is going to be from a monthly charge in those environments when we move them to Azure. And when you think about that, $62 a month to move 3 physical servers from on-prem a month? Are you kidding me? That's inexpensive. And so this is where you start seeing some of the benefits of cloud. And we're not even talking about the other stuff that you get. We're just looking at the server saying, this is what we think it's going to cost when you move it to cloud. We don't know how much it costs you to run on-prem, but I don't know, $63 to run 3 servers in a month? That seems like a pretty good deal to me. And so our assessment tools are really designed to help us work with the different assessment environments. We can create groups of computers, and all a group is a logical collection where we can add in different servers. And groups are really just for us, so we can, to help make this discovery process so we don't have to always specify. So you'll always create a group of computers when you're doing assessments, migrations. It just makes it easier saying, okay, I've already assessed this group, now I'm going to migrate this group. Well, which servers do I put in the group? Your plan will tell you. You're gonna hear that word so many times during these migration class that you're gonna get sick of hearing the word plan. But I'm telling you what, folks, if you don't have a plan, you're just setting yourself to be unsuccessful. I want you all to be successful. So I'm gonna stress plan, 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 plan. You're gonna know the order of this well before you bring up Azure Migrate, okay? Everybody's like, yes, Matt, move on, stop talking about that process. And all this discovered screen tells us what we are, what servers we have. Even though we haven't assessed some of the servers, it does discover everything for us. And the overview here, once again, takes us back into that main area for our assessments. And we can even look at our appliances. If we have multiple appliances, you can manage them. I have one appliance currently registered. Just to show you, you can have another one. And this is another appliance I just created just to have. It hasn't been currently registered, but it gives me the project key. So when I were to register that one, you can always get that project key. If I have any things that are going on, it's going to give me notifications. Here, I don't have any particular thing that's going on. Normally, if you see notifications, something has happened bad, and you have some kind of errors. But that is our migration and assessment tools. They're designed to help do that full discovery. But when we look at Azure Migrate, it is so much more, because notice we have tools for database migration. And you'll see some information here. We're going to see this in the next couple of modules. We have information for EDI. We're not actually going to do this, but you know what? VDI leverages some of the same exact technologies that we use for assessment. So that appliance gives you so much rich information. You can use that for your primary assessment here. And I don't have a migration tool for VDI, but if I say, hey, I want to add in a migration tool, I don't have any tools currently because I don't have any ISV vendors. So you need an ISV vendor for Azure Migrate to VDI. If I have web apps, it's going to look at those same tools here. I don't have any environment. And I have Databox. Now, I've mentioned Databox a couple of times. Moving the servers themselves and moving that information, relatively straightforward. But moving data, how much data do you have? How often are you going to move it into it? And so let's just kind of, I'll expand this out so we can see it a little bit better. Saying, okay, I want to import into Azure. And by the way, I just want to point out, you have the ability to export. I would love to tell you that with 100% certainty that every time people migrate to Azure, they stay in Azure, they're happy. Everything works, it's perfect, and they're there 100% of the time. Unfortunately, sometimes that's not the case. And sometimes they need to take things out of our cloud. We're really the only vendor that lets you export out and move that stuff back on-prem. And normally, when people are exporting out of Azure, and I only say this from experience, folks, guess what they forget to put in place? Yeah, exactly right. They didn't have a plan. They put something in ad hoc, it didn't work, but they started to do things with production. They have to export it to get it back on-prem to potentially re-migrate it back in, but it all depends, but you can do that. So I'm just gonna say import here. I'm gonna import it into my subscription. I'll choose my just one of my groups here. What country or region? Let's just go United States. And what destination Azure region do we want to put it in? Well, I'll just put it East 2, and I'll apply. And it gives me some parameters to start working with Databox. It's going to basically give me a little bit of a marketing page here in a moment to give me an idea of what it looks like. And it takes a moment to come up. Hopefully it'll come up here. It gives us the different choices for Databox. Now understand, when you use Databox, you're borrowing a drive from Microsoft. And what we'll do is we'll mail the drives, you'll load all the stuff up on the drives, you'll send it back to your Azure region, and then we'll offload that data. And by the way, it's all fully secured. It's all fully encrypted as it's on the drives. And all the techs do is basically throw it in your subscription and then you unencrypt it. And then we clean those drives. And by the way, if you look at the articles, it's military grade wiping of the drives, erasing the drive material, and then we potentially send it to other customers. And we have three main offerings here. Data box disk, which is basically you get 5 drives of 8 gigs or 8 terabytes apiece. We have data box, which is a 100 terabyte device. And we have data box heavy, which is a 1 terabyte, almost a petabyte of data inside of our environment. They give you the different areas in the pricing range to do this, to migrate this data and how we bring it in. The funny thing about data box heavy, that's an actual literal statement. The device does weigh about 500 pounds. So it is a heavy device when we want to migrate it in to Azure. You can also have the ability to get your own disks. If you don't want to use one of our offerings to migrate this information, you can actually get your own disks as well, and they give you some specs on that. We also have a couple of online tools that help you with the download tax that help mitigate and upload those tools. They're DataBox Edge services as well that do the same thing, but they're more of an appliance to help do that migration process. But you have the ability when you want to move data via DataBox, and once again, it's all available inside of Azure Migrate as you work through that information. A couple other things on the overview page, and we'll be back in the slides. You have a couple projects that are here, and I have my one project, my Smart Host. It's going to tell me what I've discovered, gives me information if I want to import from a CSV file. If I have other tools that I've used, it would show me all that information here. So this is a really rich tool set. It's a very well documented tool set. So from a standpoint of the types of things you can do here, you have a lot. We're actually getting some new features, containerized your .NET apps with the Kubernetes services, and Discovery ASP apps using web service using the Azure App Service. So we're starting to put some migration technologies into our other tools, all right? And that's our assessment process. So really cool, quick look. Just wanted to show you kind of what that process looks like. And again, it just takes time. And so whenever you do discovery, I know that one from my perspective took about 35, 40 minutes. And I only did 5 servers. And it's just the nature of, I was doing this all inside this environment. What's funny, that the host Hyper-V system is actually an Azure virtual machine that I've created. And so I have nested virtualization. I have a Azure VM with Hyper-V installed inside of it and Hyper-V VMs running inside of that. So I'm doing nested virtualization for the demonstrations today. Now, we've assessed the servers. We looked at them, we said, you know what? Now it's time to move. We're happy. Let's migrate those servers. And so we have a lot of third-party tools that do this. The same scenarios, right? We support Windows, Linux, even Unix, Hyper-V, VMware, physical servers, other public clouds. They're all supported. We have agentless and agent-based options, especially with VMware. You have a couple options there. We have free and paid options. You can now migrate the servers. You have Azure Migrate, you have Carbonite, you have Current, I should say, to migrate your servers. Now I'm going to actually physically move them into Azure. And so how does this work? It's actually pretty easy. Once, notice, and by the way, I should be writing on this slide right here at the very top, it says plan. Once you've planned this, run the migration tool, have those VMs set up, discover the VMs and find their dependencies so that you know when I migrate them, I'm moving that entire server. Because folks, really, when you move a server, it supports an application. We're not talking about just moving a server for the sake of moving a server. We're talking about moving a server that is an application driven. So we're understanding that we're going to move all of it. Because if, let's say, if we left our SQL server behind that supports that app, well, those VMs are in Azure, they're going to be trying to talk back to that on-prem SQL server. So once again, that deployment assessment is very important for those dependencies. The first thing we'll do with Azure Migrate, though, is we'll replicate the VMs. So the very first part of this process, and I'll show you where that is actually replicate that information. And then we can do a test migration if we want to make sure everything's functioning correctly. And then once we do a test, and the test just gives you a report, then we can push the button and do that full VM migration into Azure. The great thing about this, a lot of the work's already been done in the assessment. And now it's for us just to discover what's happening. And let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at how do I migrate VMs into Azure. So right back into our demos today. Now, this is where it gets really fun. So a couple things I want to show you that I did. And once again, a lot of them I did in time. The initial assessment and replication, that takes out another 45 minutes to an hour because I am now replicating that VM from on-prem. I'm replicating it up into Azure. Now, that's for my particular environment. That's for my particular servers that I have. And that was from an Azure VM. But chances are, guess what? This might even take longer when you're moving data from on-prem into Azure because you're replicating all that data up across the wire. And this is if you are an enterprise company and you have lots of VMs that you're going to migrate, chances are you have ExpressRoute. This is where ExpressRoute's going to help make that go faster. But at the end of the day, if you're replicating terabytes of data up into the cloud, it's terabytes of data. It's going to take a moment to move that data into Azure. Now, it tells me I have 5 discovered servers. I've actually already set some up for us. And so I've already replicated those VMs into Azure. And I haven't done a test migration yet, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I've replicated VMs. I did a test migration. I can always do another one. I have 3 healthy VMs that are replicating properly. Now, this is where this gets really cool. Azure migration is actually not, when I say relatively new, in the last couple of years, but it wasn't the first tool we had for replication, of replicating VMs into Azure. The very first tool we had was Azure Site Recovery. It had a migration engine in it. And oh, by the way, you're looking at it. This same tool lived in Azure Site Recovery before it lived as its own standalone tool set for Azure Migrate. And let me show you what I mean. I have this thing called Recovery Services Vault. And when I made my migration project, Azure Migrate set up this little area for me automatically. Why? Because this is where it's going to replicate the VMs to. This is the actual storage location for Azure Migrate. And if I go into my vault and I look at replicated items, I see those same 3 servers that are here. Why? It's using the same engine. And this is where they're being fed. So whether I see them here, I'm just looking at the replication status. When you're doing a migration, you're definitely going to perform that through the Azure Migrate process. But if I drill into one, notice I have a warning. And what that warning is, hey, we haven't done a test failover yet. So I can actually do a failover. These systems are already being protected by ASR during this process. Now, Azure Site Recovery is way out of the scope of just migration. But from a business continuity perspective, understand that once you get these VMs in Azure, you'll probably replicate these VMs with Azure Site Recovery to another region, and that region will have those VMs all turned off. They're behind a piece of glass that says break in case of an emergency. And part of that business continuity story is if something happens to my production VMs here, I can run a failover to the VMs over my other region. Oh, by the way, that could even be on-prem as well. If you have if your organization has a recovery site, you could use Azure to help replicate to that recovery site as well. There's mechanisms in place to do that. But I love to point this out because a lot of customers think, oh, it's all in Migrate. In reality, we're using the technology where it originated, which was Azure Site Recovery. And everybody's like, why is that? Well, interesting note about site recovery, and I don't know if this is still the case. I haven't checked recently, but I'm pretty sure it is. Azure Site Recovery, when it first came out, was free for the first 30 days. And what we found out, a lot of our partners that were helping customers like yourselves were using Azure Site Recovery to do lift and shift migrations. Why? Because they could get it done within the first 30 days. Why did they know they could do it in 30 days? They had a plan. Anyway, sorry, I had to sneak that in. But they could get it done within 30 days, and then they would just simply turn off site recovery services once the VMs were fully replicated into Azure. And so they didn't worry about the other components of site recovery, which is a monitoring perspective and an orchestrated failover perspective as well. And if you're kind of curious at a real high level, if you've ever done a site recovery drill for your organization from an IT perspective, you know that big manual you look at that says, okay, do these in the orders? That's what it is. You basically automate that recovery process. You can even put pauses in for human input, manual input, say, hey, let's make sure those servers are up and running. But I always like to show you a little bit under the covers of where this information's actually being stored inside of it. And you even notice it's in my resource group. So let me go back into Azure Migrate and drill back into that environment here. So they've already been replicated. And if I go to the overview here, I can see my virtual machines that have been replicated. So I'll give it a second to populate here. What are healthy machines? On how do I migrate them? Once again, I can see my replicating virtual machines. I can see my infrastructure servers where that smart host server is currently coming from. If I had any jobs running existing, I could do that. Any events that might be issues, I would know that here. Once again, the events are primarily going to be error messages that we see. But if I go into replicating virtual machines, right from here, I can simply click on migrate, and I can migrate the VMs. But it says I've already done a test, and so let me show you what that looks like. Is when I ran my test migration, and it's okay to run multiple tests, by the way. It actually showed me how those things were going to go, and so we'll give it a second here to get back into my overview screen. Hopefully it'll come up. Oops. So on my test migration, I can actually say it's been done, and I can even do more test migrations if I want. And I can look at these different items in these servers, and I can say, hey, let's do a migration from here and do a test migration to particularly clean up and work with those machines. I can even stop replication if I want to. I have ability to do other test migrations to make sure they're all right, especially if your test migration failed and maybe you made some tunes or tweaks in the VM on-prem or changed what it was going to be migrated to. You can make that and then perform it directly here from that migration perspective. But we get all that information. They're healthy. Everything's running. We're good, they're protected, and now what can I do? I can simply push the button to migrate them. Now, I'm just gonna start this. We won't see it to completion. It does take a little while to do that full migration, but I simply click on migrate here, and I say, which VM do I wanna migrate? Simply click on that one VM and click on migrate. Notice it's gonna say, hey, do you wanna shut down that VM to minimize data loss? Probably the answer is gonna be yes for that one. It's gonna do a clean shutdown of that VM inside of Hyper-V, and I simply click on migrate. And it's going to start migrating that VM, and it's going to take a little bit to finish that migration process. So I'm going to hop back into the slides. We're not going to wait for that. I just wanted to show you that's all there is. Once I know the assessment, once I know I've done a test migration, now I want to fully move it. I'm just going to migrate it. And really all this is doing, it's replicating all the deltas and the changes and turning off that VM on-prem. The cool thing about it, the VMs are already inside of Azure. It's just being in the process of updating, but that takes some time. All right. But why was it so easy? You know the word I'm going to say, plan. That's the planning process. It should be that easy when you have a plan. The tools just execute the plan, all right? How do we do migrate a VM workloads? Very similar, actually. Very similar to Azure, but we have abilities. We have to work with the VMware servers. There's some connectors. We have to activate that basically VMware HCX server and to pair it and set up. It's kind of like the registration process, but there's some nuances to it based on the VMware technology, I should say, that's there. And once we migrate those systems and once we get the assessments, then we can migrate it into Azure. Then it works the same way because whether it's Hyper-V, a VMware, or physical server, once that initial replication takes place, guess what? They're already in Azure. Same thing with physical servers. The nice thing about the physical servers, we have a configuration server that can be on-prem, it can be in Azure. That's essentially our agent server that helps run the processes, and we install agents on those systems. Specifically, we install what is called a mobility service agent, and that agent just feeds back into our server. And when we install that agent, we register it with our Azure environment, much the same way that we register our appliance, but since they're in different areas, that appliance may not have that full discovery to do the migration. We need the agent to finish that migration environment. So we still have that appliance to help do the discovery. Storage migration, I talked quite a bit about this when we're doing migration of those servers into Azure. And this is one of those ones I want to spend just a moment on this slide to talk about storage. Because most workloads inside of Azure, you know what, folks, are fairly straightforward to migrate. If you've done the plan, you know the different layers of the application, you know the different dependencies, you're going to move them. But when we start migrating storage, and I'm not talking database storages, because databases, we have some very nice tools to help migrate that, once again, migrating the apps as well. But now I'm talking about what if you have a file server on-prem, and how do I move that file server into Azure? We could do a lift and shift, although that's going to be the one that's going to cost you the most because you're spinning up a VM, and that VM has file services running on it, and then you're using the file server just like you did before. Inside of Azure Storage, we have a thing called the Azure File Service. The Azure File Service has the unique capability in all of Azure. It knows how to be spoken to via SMB, the server message block. And if you don't remember that, it's the old / server name / share name. That's what the service does. And what we can do is we can migrate just the data into that file service. And we actually have a server that's called the Azure File Sync server that does that, and it helps migrate that. And what that sync server does is it takes those files and just migrates the data. And so essentially you have two file servers, one in cloud and one in on-prem, and it keeps the data in sync. And the cloud servers for the people that are connecting to it in cloud, the sync server is the one for the stuff on-prem. If by chance, and this is just the nature of the service, if two people are working on the same file at the same time, whoever saves last wins. But the reason I mention that is because when we start talking about migrating file servers, one thing I do not want you to assume is that Azure is the best choice. Azure may not be the best choice. So if you ever work with any Microsoft folks or any third-party consultants or any of our wonderful partners, when we start talking about file servers, they're going to sit back and go, okay, let's have a conversation. Why? Because file servers are kind of unique. They're going to ask you questions like, how big are the files? How often are the files are changed? What's the goal of moving those files? What does that file server do today? And they're going to hear answers like, oh, the file server today, it's our home server for our users. Oh, well, you could move it to Azure, but we have this thing called OneDrive, and you're an Office 365 or a Microsoft 365 customer, right? Guess what? You have OneDrive. Leverage OneDrive for home server. Oh, we have this file server where everybody puts data in, but we do a lot of co-authoring with documents because Word supports all that. Oh, that's called SharePoint. Move it into SharePoint, all right? Now we have this file server where we just have a whole bunch of video files that we're going to use for our streaming service. Well, that is an Azure answer, but Azure Files probably isn't the right answer. It might be Blobs might be a better place for that file service. And then we'll use something like Content Delivery Network to move all those video files that we moved into Azure to whatever region we want inside of Azure. The point is, whenever you start moving file services from on-prem into Azure, you have to ask the question, how are we doing it? And don't assume that Azure is the best answer. OneDrive, Office 365, Microsoft 365, Teams, all of our wonderful technologies might be better answers. Once again, understanding what's the business purpose for that file share. What are we using it? Why are we using it? And what do we want to have it look like in the end? And the other thing you want to talk about is, what if we're in a hybrid scenario where I need to have my file services up in Azure or my storage up in Azure, but I need to have something running on-prem? Well, now the question happens, and by the way, whenever I have customers that say, and I don't want you to take it as a rude question, but I do ask this question. Well, why? Why are you in a hybrid scenario? Why are you have part of your files in Azure and the application running on-prem? Now that kicks off a whole nother step. Maybe they had to for compliance. Okay, great. But I'm going to ask that question. Don't mean to be rude, but I'm going to ask that question. And then I'm going to say, how big are those files coming back and down? Because chances are your application was running on-prem. You've moved the files into Azure. It's not going to be as fast as it was when it was on-prem. Why? The download tax. We have to download and work with those files. And that's where technologies like StoreSimple, Zerto, Veeam, and a whole bunch of others come into play. Why? They help us cache that information on-prem. So when we start talking migrating storage, it's all about the use case. It's all about the business case. It's all about, is it still going to remain in a hybrid mode? What's the best way to synchronize the data into the cloud? And from on-prem, and how do we bring it back on-prem? And the nice thing about those third-party devices, they become caching devices. So the very first person that says, hey, I need to go get that file, they'll have a little bit of the download tax they have to pay. The device will help mitigate that. But the second person that says, I want that same file's already there. They don't have to go download. They're just going over the local LAN. So they should send a thank you card to the first person that downloaded it. But whenever we talk about storage migration, we have lots of choices. But because of the nature of how we work with services on Azure and how we move data, is Azure the best choice? You have to ask those questions. You have to go through, what's that file server doing? It might even be, hey, we don't need that file server anymore. We can decommission it. So just go through that process to understand what's happening. But we have the migration service to help us move those stores. We can move existing files. We can even move it NetApps, Windows file servers, we can move them all into Azure. Basically, you can also create a server in Azure if you want. If you want to migrate that file server or do a lift and shift, you can create it. If you're looking to get rid of the OS of that server, because fundamentally it doesn't really matter that much, we can replicate those shares to the Azure environment. We can even do identity cutover if we're using Azure Active Directory. There's lots of ways to make sure we bring this over in a thoughtful and a secure way as we do that migration service into Azure. Last thing, as we move into this last part of the environment, you're not done once you migrate. Now those VMs, that VM1 now is hopefully migrated or in the process of being completed with migration inside of Azure. Now what? After you move, right size it. How do you know if you got the right size? Remember, Azure Guest said, hey, this was looking on-prem, but now I brought it into Azure and it's at 20% utilization. I might be overpaying for VM. I might be able to scale it down and save money. Or the alternative is, hey, that server's at 95% utilization. Maybe I need to scale it up. Remember, the assessment tool just guesses. Use the hybrid benefit for the licensing that I mentioned earlier. Hey, look, when you bring a VM into Azure, part of the cost, especially when it's a Windows VM, you're paying for the licensing of that cost. Well, think about it. You're decommissioning a server on-prem, which you bought a license for. You can take that license and apply it to the VM you're running in cloud. It's called the hybrid benefit. And that hybrid benefit will help lower the cost of that VM. It could be significantly. It could go from $150 a month to $80 a month just by applying the license. We can also do Azure Reserve instances. And what this is the ability to, if you know you're going to run a certain VM like an F1 VM or a D2 V2 instance, it's a way we can apply to our subscription. Say, you know what? We're going to buy 100 VMs. We're going to prepay them, and you can pay it off monthly or you can pay it off in one lump sum. But we're going to buy those VMs and we're going to reserve up those 100 VMs. And because you're doing that, and you're prepaying for it essentially, you're going to get a discount. Now, what happens is once that you have those 100 VMs, Azure, once you apply that to your subscription, that reserve instance, Azure's going to do the math automatically into the covers to apply the discount. Now, some of you might be thinking, what happens to the 101st VM that gets spin up? We only paid for 100. That 101st VM will go back to whatever your pricing is for that particular instance. It'll go back essentially to the full price your organization will pay, so plan those reserve instances. And I mentioned earlier, we've had customers, because they've gotten really smart around their hybrid benefit and Azure Reserve instances, they saved about $300,000 a year by being smart about that. And here's a cool thing. When they had those reserve instances, how do they tell other users to use that reserve instance? They didn't. Now, they put in a README file that nobody read. What do? They used Azure policy to say, look, when you deploy a VM, you have to use this instance. And everybody who deployed VMs had to use that instance. Now, with policy, you might be wondering, what about all the VMs that are already up and running? They stayed up and running, but they were quote unquote out of compliance. That was part of their cleanup process. They were going back in and right-sizing those VMs, moving workloads around. They had a lot of cleanup work because what happened, they didn't put governance in when they first started using Azure. So they had to do some catch-up at the end, and it wasn't bad. It was just kind of long and tedious work to get everything fixed inside the infrastructure. All right, so as you're moving, especially when it comes to VMs, look at ways to save money. After you move, look at the cloud experience. Look at the different cost management scenarios we have. You want to look at any recommendations that Azure Advisor is going to give you. Azure Advisor is going to give recommendations around cost, security. It's going to give you architectural planning costs, basically administrative environments. It gives you a lot of free assessments that are there. It's going to give you an idea of where can I save money or where can I work with it. But you're the best advisor for yourself as well, monitoring those VMs. Say that VM's always at 0 utilization. That means nobody's using it or no application's using it. Probably a good indicator. You know what? We can probably decommission that VM or at least turn it off and see what happens. I wouldn't decommission it. Probably, part of the trick of being an IT is like, hey, we're just going to turn it off right now and see if anybody notices. Has anybody ever done that in your production data centers? Like, that server never is being used. I'm just going to turn it off and see who complains. That's your assessment. If somebody comes knocking on your door, I don't know, somebody named Garrett knocks on your door and says, you know what? Why is my VM no? Now you know why that person. You say, what are you using that server on? And if they're not doing something production-wise, decommission, all right? So try turning it off first. Let somebody complain to you and go from there, or an application error out. Lastly, When you migrate to cloud, this is a journey. This is not a you're going to migrate the VMs and you're done. Chances are you're going to look for long-term value out of that. We moved the app in the cloud. We're happy with the VM. Now let's modernize that. Let's take it from IaaS. Let's move into PaaS and go from there. And so think about modernizing that and moving them off the server and moving them into the app services. And there's a lot, whether it's container service or it's our app service plans to write just code or functions. There's lots of alternative to compute options once you get the server into Azure that will be readily available to you. And they're even readily available to you. We have some customers that I work with that never even migrate VMs. They take a look at the solutions and they migrate the applications. Does it take longer? Absolutely. Long term, though, that's where they were going to head. So why have the stopgap if they don't need it? That way they can be very thoughtful of how that application moves into Azure. Okay. We talked about this in Module 1. Cloud Adoption Framework is where you get general guidance around this. Who are the right people? What's the right processes? What's the right technologies? Once again, you're going to get sick of the word plan, plan, plan. The Adoption Framework helps you plan that environment. And so when you think about all the different ways we can move, Smart Hotel had a lot of requirements. Azure Migrate meets all those requirements, but it's not the only tool in the game. As I mentioned before, we love partners here at Microsoft, and they have some other tools that help us do that migration as well. So with that, we're at the end of Module 2. Now, hopefully you enjoyed Module 2. We really focused on the different ways we can talk about moving virtual machines into Azure, and we really got our introduction into Azure Migrate, a centralized tool that's going to assist us not only from a discovery and assessments perspective, but also from a migration perspective. So let's go ahead and take another 10-minute break. We'll see everyone back here, and we'll start Module 3.